Hey people, voice talking to you. Today I've got a game that is completely off the rails. This is Warcana, a multiplayer deck builder RTS battle royale that brings the absolute insanity of a wizard war to a fast-paced strategy game. Now, if you think your brain and PC can both handle this game and you'd like to play the demo yourself, you'll find a link to it down in the description. Right next to that is a link to my Twitch channel, just in case you'd like to see my first impressions of these games. Now, admittedly, Warcana isn't an easy game to explain. In fact, the game's own tutorial doesn't do a great job of explaining how everything works. It actually ended up repeating several of the tutorial messages over and over again, but I'm also assuming that was a bug. Yes, you already told me this. Now, I'll start with a couple of disclaimers. First off, there is no story to this game, which is totally fine considering its genres. I just want to make sure you're aware in case you're looking for story games. Secondly, this game has an overwhelming amount of flashing lights, bright colors, and shifting patterns, so if you're at risk of seizures or easily overstimulated, be cautious with this title. I'll admit I found myself highly overstimulated pretty quickly, though I did get used to it and it became easier to handle over time. The game can change pretty drastically between modes. Multiplayer is a massive battle royale between up to 30 players. If you're not big on multiplayer though, don't worry. There's also a surprisingly fleshed out single-player campaign mode. The campaign offers different challenges that force the player to adapt their strategy to complete different goals and use different decks and abilities, so it's a great way to learn the game and grow your skills too. Now, I did try out both of these game modes, but all the footage in this video is just from the campaign, so let's start with that. The campaign is spread out over a map that walks the player through the basics before branching off into increasingly difficult and more complex challenges. Among these are matches against different kinds and numbers of AI opponents and modified games where the player must complete a specific task, such as wiping out a certain number of enemy units. So how do matches work in Warcana? Well, the goal of the match is, unless otherwise stated, to destroy every enemy wizard's main building. This is literally the name for the structure. Just call it a stronghold or something. At the same time, however, we'll need to protect our own central structure from enemy attacks if we want to be the last one standing. Players have two primary resources to utilize: structure and mana. There's lots of different ways to come by these resources depending on your cards and devotion, but economy buildings are your main method of production. Structure is primarily used to play building cards and to construct walls. We can also earn additional structure by destroying enemy buildings. Mana is typically used for summoning armies and casting spells. When it comes to building cards, there are tons of different kinds, including economy buildings, barracks, and defensive towers. Playing a building card works just like construction in any other RTS, but without the build time. You just drag it onto the field and drop it where you want it to be, so long as there's space there. Each wizard has their own floating island where only they can build, so there's no need to worry about other players claiming your territory. We will need to be smart about how we place buildings though. Not only does each structure take up space, but each has its own upgrade tree that offers us a choice about what benefit that specific building brings us. Barracks will typically add army cards to our deck, while economy buildings can add tower cards, spells, and other econ structures, or simply provide passive income of resources. Just remember, every building destroyed by an enemy gives them more structure to work with, so plan your defense accordingly. Walls are pretty basic overall, and serve primarily to slow down enemy troops and protect buildings. You don't need any cards to place walls, but I did notice a couple of particularly annoying issues with the building UI. First off, there's a limit to how far you can drag your wall placement, so forget about quickly blocking off an entire entry point. Also, when placing buildings and walls in particular, it's very difficult to tell which spaces are occupied and which aren't, especially when walls are clustered or layered. So I can't tell where there are walls missing because of the UI here. There's two ways I can see to solve this. The first would be to add a full top-down perspective so the player can better see the grid. This would likely involve a lot of extra artistic work though, so I'd recommend the second option, which is when the player is placing a structure, a grid overlay appears and any placed structures are hidden or at least made transparent with occupied spaces marked, so players can quickly and easily place walls. Though there are a few spells that can harm or hinder enemy troops, your primary defense will be your towers, and there's quite a variety of different towers to experiment with. Each tower has its own range and firing pattern, denoted in a clearly visible yellow grid when they're being placed. Some towers excel at long range, while others deal wide AoE attacks, while others still are best used to push back melee troops. Different devotions will have different buildings, and towers with different strengths and weaknesses. Since I've mentioned devotions, let me briefly cover deck building. A wizard's devotion essentially dictates which school of magic they have mastered. You won't need centuries of study though, and can switch between these devotions or even mix and match a couple of them to suit your playstyle. In addition to different armies and buildings, each devotion also comes with a unique perk to further improve a specific strategy. For example, Fey Wizards don't have particularly strong armies, but their buildings naturally regenerate, and their ability to quickly accrue mana allows them to cast tons of healing spells. Alternatively, Demon Wizards can quickly overwhelm opponents with massive armies and punish opponents for destroying buildings by spawning even more. Now, as cool as the different playstyles and decks were, there were also a couple of mechanical issues I noticed. For one, when playing with a mixed deck of two devotions, the chosen primary perk doesn't seem to function. If this is a balancing choice to curb multiclassing, this needs to be stated, and the icon showing your perk needs to be removed. Additionally, some devotions seemed severely underpowered compared to others. The Void Forging devotion in particular, I couldn't seem to figure out. This devotion is primarily focused on rapidly stacking up structure economy, but its perk makes it so that destroying enemy buildings earns you mana instead of structure. This devotion doesn't have many spells, and its armies cost structure instead of mana, so I don't know how this helps at all. It could be that I just didn't figure it out, but the high number of economy buildings clogging your hand prevents army summoning, plus the economy bonuses only trigger if the buildings survive, but the towers available are largely artillery and not great at keeping enemies at bay, so you end up with a rapidly declining economy instead of a growing one. With that aside, let's get back into the reason you're actually here: the battles. Matches are divided up into two phases, the building phase and the battle phase. During the building phase, no armies can cross between islands, so this is the best time to set up new defenses and play building cards. When the battle phase begins, any armies played during the building phase are spawned. You can still build, summon, and cast spells during this phase, it's just there will be thousands of units to contend with as well. And yes, I did say thousands. Each army card played summons units numbering between several hundred and a few thousand at a time. And if you stack your deck right, you can easily end up with an army numbering in the tens of thousands. And yes, they will all be on the screen at the same time. As long as there's still room for them to stand, that is. They can't even get out of the spawn area. There's too many bell demons. That's also on top of the opposing armies on your island as well. To defeat an opponent, you'll have to destroy their main building before the battle phase ends. At the end of each battle phase, all remaining units on every island are wiped out. Any destroyed buildings and walls are magically restored, and the islands separate for another build phase. Each round, the build phase gets a little shorter, and the battle phase gets a little longer, leading to a rapidly escalating battle where units get closer and closer to their goal. The sheer scale of these battles is completely insane. Each unit is its own entity with its own animations and pathing, and they're all made in an awesome pixel art design with a surprising level of detail. Watching thousands upon thousands of these magical monsters surge against walls and get wiped out by glittering lasers and magic rockets is one hell of a spectacle. They've got lasers. It's also surprisingly entertaining to zoom in and observe single units as they make their way through the battlefield. They might just be one in a sea of thousands, and they're destined to perish in a magical explosion, but seeing how your minions make their way through the map and the little animations is kind of endearing. Look at them go! Speaking of the maps, there's a solid variety to the floating islands I mentioned. With different biomes and layouts to allow for different defensive strategies, the game does a good job of keeping things fresh on the building front. Different defensive layouts also mean you'll need to adapt your offensive strategy as well. The best strategy isn't always to throw as many units as you can at your opponent, however, though it's not a bad idea either. Different troops have different strengths and weaknesses, and the order and time at which you play them can mean the difference between victory and defeat. Each army has its own health value, damage to walls, and damage to towers. Some will excel at soaking up damage, while others can fire over walls, and others are just great at smashing through walls. Choosing which troops you get from your barracks and which spells to best support them is the foundation of good offensive strategy. When each player has a solid deck built, the battlefield is an absolute madhouse. I imagine a tournament between skilled Warcana players would be crazy to watch, and the visuals of the game are reflective of how rapid fire the gameplay is. You aren't given 30 plus minutes to build, so working fast and multitasking under pressure is an absolute must. This is easily one of the fastest paced RTS games I've played, and while I'm not sure if the Battle Royale edition is more fun than a one-on-one battle, the overlap between strategies and different armies creates even more chaos. That means, if you haven't figured it out by now, this is never going to be a chill experience, and I'd almost equate it to something like a MOBA. This is a problem. Overall, Warcana is a visual marvel and a lot of fun to play once you get the hang of it. Admittedly, there's a bit of a hard learning curve, especially for multiplayer, but the campaign mode does a decent job of easing new players into the mechanics, even if it repeats itself quite a bit. On the audio side of things, there was a bug where the background music would only play in the campaign map when a level was selected, and there was quite a bit of UI gore with overlapping displays. You can't freely move around the map, and some of the levels you need to click on are underneath a separate menu. No quality of life. Look at this. I'd also like to see a bit more variety with sound effects for units and spells, and the music tracks for battle, which I think there was only one of. As scatterbrained and chaotic as Warcana can be, it comes together in a surprisingly harmonious and visually marvelous experience. If you're a fan of fast-paced RTS and deck-building strategy, I think this one is definitely worth a try. It's got some growing pains, for sure, but if the kinks get worked out, Warcana will be an absolute blast to play. I'm just the voice in your head though, so what do you think about Warcana? Do you see the influence of some other big-name strategy games? What do you think of the art style? Do you think your PC will catch on fire if too many units spawn at once? Let's talk about it down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, leaving a like really helps me out, and subscribing is the best way to see more videos, because I put out new stuff every single week. Thanks so much for listening to me today, and you'll be hearing from me again real soon. Too many foxes.